have the most amazing creation story any people have ever had. Well, good morning. This part of the program is going to be something that I think we adults, in terms of the progressive worldviews in religious, theological ways, have a tendency to think somebody else will take care of. I can't tell you the number of liberal churches, particularly liberal Christian churches that I've been in, where they have amazing adult programs, religious education programs, and they've done a lot to the worship services to update them for these times and to make them relevant for the kinds of understandings we have about our global world now. And yet I walk into the religious education wing, and the kinds of books they have and the kinds of curricula they're using are still about things that kids do not find very relevant to themselves. So anyway, that's what this is going to be about. We're going to have it in 3 parts. I'm going to spend about 10 to 15 minutes here at the outset with a few notes talking about the first part of my title. And the first part of my title is How Religion is Failing Our Youth. How religion is failing our youth. And the second part, and what we can do about it, will be the bulk of the presentation, the last 3/4 of the presentation, where I'll turn over to the slides, and I'm going to give you some examples of what we are doing about it, the good news of how we can bring this perspective into younger generations and how well they're receiving it. I'd like to start off with just reflecting on what life was like for both children and adults before our modern period. And that is going back for centuries, millennia, even millions of years, once our hominid ancestors started talking. Children grew up in what might be called a one-story world. A one-story world. And what I mean by that is that everything known, everything they heard from the elders, everything that was imagined was part of the same story, and satellite stories and parables and aphorisms and sayings that might go on. It was all coherent. All of the facts and all of the values and virtues and character development and how you related to your community and how the generations related to one another and what you thought about your ancestors and how you felt about your responsibilities for the future were all part of the same story. It all cohered. This was a story that was available to provide meaning and solace and inspiration for both good times and bad. That's what these stories were for. That's the evolutionary purpose of a worldview that integrates everything, which indigenous anthropologists for indigenous traditions tend to call life ways. It's all integrated with everything, and we here tend to call religions. It dealt, of course, with the living and with the dead, and with those yet unborn who were coming to be. It was a coherent story, religio, after all, the root lig, ligament, ligature, connect, come together. That's what religions are. That's their evolutionary purpose, to help us function in communities larger than our instincts would allow. Our instincts give us a natural inclination to cooperate and care about people within our kin group, within our families, who speak the same language, who tell the same stories. The religions help us to come together for people who are very different from ourselves, but we share the same story, and that's what religions have always done. Now, an important thing about that one-story world was that whether you were a child or an adult, there was never any reason to doubt that one story that explained everything. There's no reason to doubt. But you would not hear other stories. Now, of course, You know, unless perhaps you're in an Amish or a very strictly religious fundamentalist setting in the United States, children are going to hear diverse perspectives. They're going to be going to school with kids who have very different religious holidays than they do. They're going to be asking questions. Also, back in those times, there was no distinction about modern science. There were no scientists there acting in an evidential way to test, is this story that we've passed down over the generations, is this true? There were no scientists back then to doubt, to be skeptics, to question. And yet there are today, and in the past decade, they've become very, very vociferous. So what we have is that we are, as adults, living in a fragmented world. We get pieces of information. Kids are coming up with whatever we may end up teaching them or not teaching them in liberal Christian contexts, where they're hearing about and reading about stories about people who lived in a different part of the world, have nothing to do with them, or in a very progressive, multi-religious context. I'm a Unitarian Universalist myself, and so we pride ourselves in teaching kids the world religions. We want to make sure they can be global citizens and relate to people of different religions. But what we know is that children are fascinated with things that they don't hear in their scriptural stories. How many of you had childhood fascination with dinosaurs? I certainly did. Nowadays, kids see the Hubble space photos or watching NOVA and National Geographic programs. They're fascinated with supernovas. They're fascinated with ice ages. In progressive religious contexts, we tend to teach a multiplicity of stories, and that has its uses. But it also contributes to this sense of fragmentation. Very recently, I was in with a group of kids doing one of my all creatures great and small type religious education programs. I'll show you examples of that. And one of the things I did for the first time, and it worked out very well, is I looked at the kids and I said, do you know that you know more about something than Jesus knew? And I said, how many of you know what a penguin is? Raise your hands. Where do penguins live? Antarctica. Did you know Jesus never knew penguins existed? And Jesus did not know about Antarctica. And it's like, this understanding. We need kids to start feeling that so they don't have a sudden aha experience when they're starting to move into middle school or their teenage years, and they start to question. We need to have that provisioned right from the beginning. I was doing a religious exploration program for kids while Michael was doing a sermon at a Unitarian church in South Florida. And I had what I really like to have, a mixed age group, upper elementary and middle school. And I asked the kids, I said, give me some examples of creation stories from around the world. Well, kids raised their hand. They, of course, knew the Genesis story, Native American myths, some Greek myths. And then I stopped, and I said, very good, very good. And I said, what's your creation story? Not a hand went up. So then I just started saying, in the beginning, what scientists call the Big Bang, what Michael and I like to call the epic of evolution. And the hands went up and said, oh, we're learning that in science class. Yes, they're learning that in science class. And that's their creation story. That's not what separates them out from religious people. It's what unites them with people, secular, religious, doesn't matter, all over the world. It's our universal story, built by scientists of all religious faiths in all countries, everywhere. Not a single other religion has an origin story that encompasses the whole globe. And not a single other religion is a story of a changing story. That rather than when something happens and we learn about penguins, we go, yes, this becomes part of our story. It's all added in. So this cosmic creation story is what Michael and I promote. He to adults, me to children and adults at times. Now, what's the problem if we don't give kids their creation story? Unite all the disparate geology, astrophysics, dinosaurs, culture, the history of peoples. What happens if we don't unite them into a story? Colleagues of ours wrote a book in 2006. Joel Primack, he's an astrophysicist. Nancy Ellen Abrams, his wife, is a cultural historian. It's called View from the Center of the Universe. It's one of the greatest books. 2006, View from the Center of the Universe. Here's my favorite quote from that book. Joel and Nancy wrote, "Without a meaningful, believable story that explains the world we actually live in, people have no idea how to think about the big picture. And without a big picture, we are very small people." Without a big picture, we are very small people. And we are vulnerable to searching, reaching out for a big picture that will give us solace when we encounter the inevitable downturns in life. I can't tell you the number of Unitarian Universalist contexts I've been in where older men and women come up to me and say, "Do you have anything we can give to our grandchildren?" And I'll say, "What? I don't know. Tell me what's going on there." I say, "Well, our daughter became a fundamentalist, and I'd really like to have our..." This is not uncommon. We have to provide a cosmic creation story that religios everything and is no less meaningful, no less provider of solace and comfort in difficult times, no less practical help for what we need in life and how we relate and how we understand death than any of the other stories. Loyal Rue, the philosopher of religion, he just retired from a college in Iowa very recently. He's a colleague of ours. Back in 1989, he wrote his first book, the title, Amythia. Amythia. That's the name he's given to this malady of what happens when we have a culture that for the very first time doesn't have an overarching worldview to embrace us and carry us through life with a sense of meaning and purpose. Amythia. Join with me in just reflecting for a moment. I want you to reflect on your own childhood experience of whatever religious or worldview interaction you had that answered your first questions, that helped you get a sense of who you are and what your larger context and community is. So if you could just get a little comfortable in your seats, and I invite you to close your eyes for a moment. And think back to your elementary years, particularly early elementary years. What was it about whatever your church or temple or synagogue or whatever the environment was that your family took you to where something special was going on and that this was a repeated thing? What elements of that did you imprint on? What elements of that were really, really good? Fascination, where your mind moved, and that you find even as an adult now, when you're in that context, perhaps candle lighting or Christmas hymns or chanting or stained glass windows or particular music. What did you imprint on that has that magical, deep emotional quality? Now, let's move to the more dark side. Was there anything in your childhood experience in these contexts that in the moment frightened you, saddened you, or perhaps something that was part of your regular experience, but as you began to question in later childhood or your teen or adult years, it angered you when you discovered something that you were given as a child that you then rejected as an adult? So both the good and the bad. Okay, I invite you to come back to right now as adults today. This word imprinting. This word imprinting is what I want to emphasize, because there's an opportunity in the life cycle of an individual, a short window of time, where as children we will imprint. We will imprint. And if we're so concerned about not indoctrinating our children into one worldview, then we're going to miss that opportunity. And they may not have it, or they may get it from their friends on the playground who say, can I, come on to my Bible summer camp with me, we'll have fun playing. It could happen. We need to take charge of this. Children are evolutionarily provisioned to listen to what adults say and believe it. So I'm going to give you a presentation now using the slides, giving you an example of curricula of how we can bring children to a one-story universe. Maria Montessori advocated this back in the early 20th century. She called it the story of the universe. Many of us call this story the epic of evolution. It's not just the science facts, it's how it becomes meaningful. And in a religious context, unlike public schools, but in a religious context, we can embed values that we want to pass forward as well. I'd like to suggest that for liberal religious churches, such as Unitarian Universalism, mine own, we know that we need to attract young families in order to survive. Okay? All religious denominations here in the modern world are experiencing a diminishment in interest in membership. So we know we need to attract young families to survive. I'd like to switch that around, and I'd say liberal churches need to survive and be supported by us gray-haired and white-haired people doing our volunteer services and putting in our finances in order to serve young families who want their kids to have religio, something that makes sense of everything and yet is congruent with the best science of our time. And as the science changes, the story will change too. So this is my call to action for folks like those of us here in this room who care about how religions are evolving to serve our changing, globalizing culture. I'd like to suggest that we need to provision children with a basic human requirement. We need to provision them with a coherent cosmology, a creation story, a worldview through which to enjoy and securely navigate the years of childhood wonder, learning, and innocence. I'd like to help ensure that current and future generations of children here in the USA do not have to experience a childhood of amythia, fragmentation, lacking a creation story, lacking an overarching sense that can embrace and contain and explain all the different religions of the world. Amythia. I'd like to give them a one-story universe. Doesn't mean any less celebrating of diversity, but a one story that embraces all the diverse perspectives. Like to have it be where there's an integration of facts and values. They need to have a sense of identity that's secure, takes them through childhood, and they need to have a sense of ancestry, whether or not they're adopted. Their ancestors go far back through human times, all the way back to bacteria, all the way back to the stars, as I'll explain later on. They need to have this sense. They need to have this presented not as another science lesson. I've seen curricula in my own tradition, Unitarian Universalism, that thinks the way you present this story is like a science lesson. No! The science comes along while they're getting stories and participatory games and doing crafts. They don't know that they're getting the science. And you know what? Before kids reach about third grade or so, virtually all of them delight in learning about nature. They haven't been turned off from learning yet. Children love to learn. And guess what? In Sunday school, there's no tests. What an ideal situation. Children can come for the delight of it. And most of them are well rested by Sunday morning, too. It's an amazing opportunity. So here's some examples. Here's a picture of me doing a story for all ages in a Unitarian context. You can see I'm using some Hubble photos there. Michael and I are enormously privileged because we do travel around. For 11 years, we've been traveling around. We've been in all 48 of the 50 states presenting programs, some for children. And what it means is every time I create a new curriculum, I get to test it out. And I see what works and what doesn't. And then the next church we go to, and I get to test it out again. It's a tremendous opportunity. Everything I'm going to talk about is on our website, thegreatstory.org, and there is right here, it's called Kids Curricula. Everything I show on here, everything I talk about, you can have access to there, so you don't need to take notes. Just enjoy. I also have on the Kids Curricula, I have access to our friend Jennifer Morgan. She wrote the best series of children's books to give the entire story from the Big Bang all the way up through the creation of religions. She never uses the word God in here, so it can be for both secular and religious contexts, but it's absolutely, the science is absolutely spot on, it's playful. We highly recommend this. You can get this to this from our website as well. Now you'll come to this part of this page here. I'm going to go through a number of these curricula here. I'm only going to talk about the elementary grades, not middle school. We do stuff for middle school too, and not about the teenage years. I just want to concentrate on this time in every human's life in which we will imprint. We will imprint. It's also been called the wonder years. These are the years in which children have not yet the capacity to understand metaphor. Okay? It's called concrete literalism. The great religious educator of the early 20th century, Sophia Fahs, recommended not teaching Bible stories to anyone younger than upper elementary, preferably older than that. Why? Because they'll take it as magical. And then, if they learn later that they have to give up those stories the same way they gave up Santa Claus, what's left? What's left? Perhaps anger. So let's talk about first, really the first one that we came up with, just launching, before we launched On the Road 11 years ago, evolutionary parables. This one's really fun. Evolutionary parables are fun, poignant, and values-rich ways of learning the science-based epic of evolution, also called big history. Michael talked about that last night. The academic interdiscipline that supports what elements go into these stories is big history. So parables, of course, is the way that Jesus taught. Maybe Native American cultures, they don't say do this, don't do this. No, they teach values, right relationship in the form of parables, so that the children are getting an interesting story and they're absorbing values without having to be told. And as they age, then they see the stories in a new light. In many cultures, there was no such thing as special stories for children or special events for children. It was events for the whole community, geared for adults, and then the children would pick up through each year. They'd experience the same ritual, and then again and again. And as their brains developed, they would have new understandings, more nuanced understandings of what those stories meant. Here's pictures that we have. I'll show you here too. These include scripts with volunteers. Children can read it. Here we have myself as a narrator, 2 adults, and then there's an adult and a child acting out what they're hearing. There's no rehearsal in these. We just invite people up. Here, these people have been invited up to do one during the world's first evolutionary revival. Praise Darwin. This was in California. And again, these people, they just acted it out. They hadn't read it in advance. The very first one written was Ozzie and the Snortlefish. And we were very fortunate to be living nearby where the man who wrote Green Lantern and some of the first Batman comics was living. He was retired from that activity, of course. But he was interested in the epic of evolution, and he came to events that Michael was organizing. And so we went, I had been writing just sort of stories the way a grown-up would stand there and read a story, but I asked him whether he would write an evolutionary parable. And of course, he didn't just write a story, he wrote it in dialogue format. He also embedded some values in there. The main ones were the importance of taking initiative and having determination. The science lesson was fish evolve limbs and come onto land. Okay? So this was a playful story about the fishes and some of what we know from the fossil evidence and what was going on for them to ultimately crawl out and become amphibians and then reptiles and then, of course, our ancestors as well. This is a clip from what the teacher's guide looks like here, but there's variations on this, and it's good for adults or kids. The Lucky Little Seaweed was the second parable we had written. Once I had the script of dialogue of Ozzie and the Snortlefish, these personifications, animation. You can take fish and you can have them talking to one another, okay? Without violating scientific principles. It's what we all do. They can learn the science while the fish are talking to each other. So we took this script over to a friend of mine who is a paleontologist whose specialty was plants coming out of the ocean, algae, seaweed coming out of the ocean, and then symbiotically joining up with fungus to become land plants. And that's the science of how it happened. And so in this one, the sense, the values teaching, while the science is being understood, is cooperation. Just last summer, Michael and I were attending an international big history convention, and I'm serving as narrator, and these are a couple people I just asked for volunteers. They did not see the script in advance. Here's the Lucky Little Seaweed. Here's the fungus, the antagonist here. And they're acting it out just without any preparation. It's a really fun thing to do. Lucky Little Seaweed is the one that has been most used in my Unitarian Universalist tradition for intergenerational services. Sunday morning, it's been used. The one that I wrote, the first one that I wrote, attempting to use a script format, is called Pluto's Identity Crisis. Remember back about 8-10 years ago, where Neil deGrasse Tyson and others were going, we've been starting to find some other rocks out there beyond Neptune that really aren't planets. And there was a couple years where it was question about what they were. Now, of course, they're dwarf planets, but I took that as an opportunity to, believe it or not, teach about friendship and adoption. Poor little Pluto isn't considered a planet. Pluto wasn't even sure that Pluto was part of the solar system. So it took a voyage in with friend Icy Comet to come in and finally meets the sun. The sun adopted Pluto from the outer realm and loves Pluto as much as all the other planets in its great family. So here's the character: Pluto, Icy Comet, generic planet, the sun, and narrator. And here's where you can see the scarves of the sun and Icy Comet here. And again, just acting it out with no advanced planning. It can, of course, be done by older students in advance and staged with costumes and all that, but you can also run it just like this. Probably the best parable I'll ever write is called Startull, the story of an average yellow star. And the reason it's the best parable is that it sometimes makes grown-ups cry. when I do it for grown-ups, best for mixed audiences. Here are all the values. Talks about life stages, mentors, life purpose, service, death as natural and necessary. I do not believe we should shield our young from the fact that death happens. And even though it can be very sad, without the death of elders, there would be no room for children on a finite planet. Without the death of stars, there would be no planets and no life. And so before I do this parable, here again you can see the characters: big blue, Startull is an average yellow star, young star. Elder yellow star comes in at the beginning, about the age of our sun. Our sun is a middle-aged, average yellow star. And our sun is going to turn into a red giant. He's going to put on the red scarf about 3 billion years from now, nothing to worry about. And then die, okay? So before I use this parable, if I'm with grown-ups or have a longer time in class, I will introduce the periodic table of elements. Now, why? Here's the science underlying the parable. When a star first lights up, it takes the simplest element there is, hydrogen, and squeezes it into helium. It's what our sun is doing now. But when our sun runs out of hydrogen, about 3 billion years from now, it's going to have to start squeezing the helium into carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. It will become a red giant for about 1 billion years. And then it'll use that up and it will die. Now, all of the other elements, in the beginning there was nothing but hydrogen and some helium in the universe, a little bit of lithium and beryllium too, but none of these other elements. In the very beginning, after the Big Bang, there were stars, but you could not have any planets. There was nothing solid to make any planets from. All the rest of these elements are born not in average yellow stars. They come from big blues. Stars that are born 8 to 100 times more massive than our sun, more gravity. They have very short lives because they squeeze the hydrogen so quickly into helium and then in a supernova explosion create all the other elements. Now, when I'm working with young kids, I'll usually just introduce this. I call it the new periodic table of elements. You can see here a little yellow star, our sun, or Startull, the story of an average yellow star, hydrogen into helium. Red giants create carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen, and supernovas create all the rest. And I'll always do things like, okay, who knows what this is? It's what you put in swimming pools to keep the algae away. It is chlorine, okay. And right here, this is what makes our bones strong. It is calcium, okay. I'd love to have children introduced to this fun way so that when they get into 10th grade chemistry, they don't freak out when they see the periodic table. They imprint on, wow, this is Startull, the story of an average yellow star, rather than, what do I need to know for the test? Big difference. I also like to show Hubble photos. Here a red giant having sputtered out into a white dwarf, and here a supernova. We have the most amazing creation story any people have ever had. And once kids get old enough to appreciate metaphor, they can appreciate the others, as Joseph Campbell taught many of us back in the late 1980s with his Power of Myth. So what comes of this is kids learn that we're made of stardust. We have glorious ancestors. Whether we know our human ancestors or not, we all go back to the stars. Now, I've made an 8-week curriculum out of this material, tested each element of it, and then there's some other weeks in here, including the Startull parable, if religious educators or Montessori classrooms want to use it or not. But even when I go in just for a 50-minute Sunday morning guest teaching program into a religious education class, I'll always do what I call the cosmic communion ritual. And what that is, you can see me doing it here in a classroom. This little girl is holding a shell I bring with me, and she has stardust in it. Now, everything's stardust, right? Everything but hydrogen and helium is created from stars, but some things look more like stardust than others. So that's glitter. And what she's getting ready to do is to glitter. Give me some glitter on my forehead, or a child can choose on the back of a hand. And we pass this around the whole circle while we're singing this. I'll teach this to you. Don't have to be able to have any words. This I tried to make look like a star. This looks like the old 1950s view of what an atom looked like. This is what some of you who maybe tried to make breakfast this morning sometimes happens. On burnt toast, the carbohydrates, the hydrogen goes off as steam and oxygen, and we're left with pure carbon. We breathe from the sky, oxygen. What makes our bones strong? Calcium. And what's inside blood that attaches to oxygen when we cut ourselves and turns red like rust? Iron. Okay, so here's how the song goes. I'll sing it through once and join me a second time. We are made of stardust, every single atom, of carbon and of oxygen, calcium and iron. Join me. We are made of stardust, every single atom, of carbon and of oxygen, calcium and iron. I wish I had imprinted on the idea that we are made of stardust when I was a child. Michael and I were both invited to put in chapters into a Skinner House book, which is a publisher of the Unitarian Universalist Association, in 2010 by Frederick Muir. My chapter I called We Are Stardust, the Epic of Evolution in Children's Religious Education. Through my kids' curriculum page on thegreatstory.org, you can download it in PDF. I'd like to give you two key paragraphs from there. A grand narrative that pertains to everyone, and that we would therefore teach our children wholeheartedly in religious education, exploration settings. It seems antithetical to the postmodern ethos of identity politics and religious tolerance championed by religious liberals. Nonetheless, to remain on the vanguard of progressive perspectives and values, it is time for religious liberals to place our celebration of diversity within a wider arc that offers the promise of universal relevance and a sense of global community. Our bodies are made of stardust. Our souls are made of stories. I was doing an intergenerational Stardust service at the Unitarian Universalist Church in Raleigh, North Carolina. And Reverend Tom Rhodes was a minister then, and he introduced the whole concept using this line. He invented this. Our bodies are made of stardust. Our souls are made of stories. I love that. I'm going to give you a couple examples now of stories that I've gathered from how children relate to these ideas, particularly of stardust. Michael and I just got word from senior minister of the Unitarian Universalist Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It's one of the top, biggest Unitarian congregations in the United States. And he said he used opening words from me to open Easter, his sermon for Easter services. And that is, it's a quote where I was talking about stardust. He used this stardust theme in order to interpret death and resurrection, the holiest of holy holidays, from the standpoint of the death of stars, resurrected then in planets and life, and then people into new generations and new. Taking the scientific story and finding a way to have it illuminate traditional religious stories, such that our science mind and our mythic mind aren't in conflict. He did an extraordinary job, Marlon Lavanhar at the All Souls Unitarian in Tulsa. In New Jersey, this is one of my favorite stories. I will never use the term passed away, ever. As religious educators, we know we never say grandma went to sleep and she just didn't wake up. No, there are things you don't do. But even passed away, no. There's something about death that we want to honor. It's active. And so what I do is I'll ask children this. I'll say, do any of you have a grandparent who has already become an ancestor? It's not passing away. They're becoming something. They're becoming an ancestor, just like our stars are ancestors. I was in New Jersey doing a religious education program, and there was a boy who excitedly raised his hand. It wasn't a sad thing. My grandma became an ancestor January 26, 2004. Now that doesn't take away the immediacy of the grief, but it means they've become something. And this is not unlike indigenous traditions around the world. Dead people become ancestors, and they're still a vital part of how life is lived in the moment. My favorite story about Stardust is Michael and I had done a summer weekend program for a Unitarian church in Durango. And about 2 years later, we came back and we did another program there. And there was a young woman, a young mother, who ran up to me the second time and she said, Connie, I've got to tell you a story about what my youngest son just a couple weeks ago said. I said, okay. She said, remember you were here last time and you did your We Are Made of Stardust program for the kids? She said, well, I brought my 5-year-old and I brought my 4-year-old, both. I didn't think the 4-year-old was going to get anything out of it, but my 5-year-old. And listen to what my youngest one said, who's now 6. I was telling him about something that had gone on in the family, our family in the past. And he said, Mom, was I born yet? And the mom said, no. And the boy said, oh, was I in your belly yet? No. Oh, I must have still been stardust. Wow. Okay, so we've been through evolutionary parables. We're not going to do all of these. We've been through Made of Stardust. I'd like to do the next one that's been really powerful. This is something, great story beads. Great story beads are a symbolic representation of the 13.7 billion year epic of cosmos, earth, life, and humanity, told as a sacred story that embraces all other sacred stories, including our own personal journeys. Children learn that they belong to the universe and that they have magnificent ancestors. So what usually happens is the RE director or volunteer will have gathered in advance beads. This represents the first stars. This comes later. It represents the birth of our sun, and so on. So first thing people need to do is choose a timeline. Every time I see a new timeline, I put it up there so that there's some choice involved. The most intricate one is by our friend John Cleland Host, who's a PhD chemical engineer, an amazing scientist. And he's got beads that must have like 300 or so in them. What's interesting here, this green one is Lucky Little Seaweed. Here he used Sculpey clay to create an Ozzie character, the first fish, Tiktaalik, actually a descendant of Tiktaalik, to come out onto land. This is another Sculpey clay he made for, what was the supercontinent called before the dinosaurs? Pangaea, exactly. So he's got this Pangaea. This dark bead here represents the Permian-Triassic Great Extinction. This is the Cretaceous extinction, so there's dinosaurs and flowers in here. And you notice he's got other ones here. These are actual tektites, pieces of meteors that have fallen to Earth that he's flattened out and painted with white. This is his nephew's beads, and this is for his kids and nephews. He's got quite a few here. Now, what's he going to put on that white? This next slide is going to show you a picture of him getting the signature of Walter Alvarez, who in 1980, with his father Louis Alvarez, published the paper to explain why the dinosaurs went extinct. Meteor hitting down. I remember when that paper came out, and it was just so exciting to finally learn why the dinosaurs went extinct. So here's Walter, a geologist. John is approaching him, asking him to sign his little tektite beads. And so here's a picture of Walter actually signing each of the beads, and here's what they look like. So even adults can do cool stuff with the great story beads. So been through the great story beads. My universe story, you see it's for 3rd and 4th grade, but I've had kindergarten, homeschoolers with kindergartners do this, this one. And it's using the beads, but it's stretching it out into pretty much a full year curriculum. It's got 28 weeks to it, plus some other activities in between for catch-up time and so forth. What's in red are when I suggest that the kids make their own beads out of Sculpey clay for each of these 28 episodes. The rest of the time you just go to a bead shop and get something that looks like it represents. I had a woman from a Unitarian Universalist congregation send me a picture of when the kids, the crafts project for galaxies form and small galaxies merge into bigger galaxies like our Milky Way. Here's a picture that I was sent from the same teacher when her kids got to the 9th week. Animals such as sponges and jellyfish, and later clams and fish, evolve in the oceans. So this has a script here for interaction with the kids, and this guy has created this outfit to become a jellyfish. Also in here we have plants come out onto land and amphibians, fish come out, and so we have Ozzie and the Snortlefish and the Lucky Little Seaweed are part of the program. So you see how it's all integrated. It's not fragmented. Now very important, the last part here are all human related. Primates live in the trees and evolve fingers and toes to hold on to branches. I mean, Michael and I, driving down here from Fort Payne, looking at the beautiful spring, the little leaves coming out on the trees on the side of Lookout Mountain and along the road, realize that if trees had never evolved, we would not be here. Our ability to make tools requires, I mean, dolphins may be really smart, but they cannot build telescopes. They cannot hold a hammer and nails. If trees had never come into being, there would have been no primates up in the trees, no fingers and toes, no humans. Is that amazing? New relationship we have to trees. So what happens is each week there's 28 squares here. Each child has one of these they keep, and they tape on a bead each week so that at the end of the whole curriculum they then string them and create a whole bead set. So for this particular My Universe story, it's the only full year curriculum I have yet. A number of objectives here. I'm just going to rush through a few, but to combat our culture's debilitating amythia. That's a major one. Second one, to help participants learn their story. To engage students in the creative art of storytelling and playful participation. This is not like science class. It's a game. It's using their imagination. They're contributing. To encourage a sense of kinship and love for all of life. To offer children the security and wonder that they arise from an amazing ancestry. To subtly teach liberal, ethical, and earth-caring values and traditional values that are widely shared. To have children engage in a long-term craft project, this is the beads, each week getting a bead, that fosters patience and then culminates in a sense of accomplishment, and then they get to take them home. to help children understand that a story based on science, it evolves as new discoveries are made. And it's based on actual evidence. Michael and I like to call this epic of evolution the story of the changing story. Every time a new scientific discovery, I had to rewrite the Pluto parable. Because when I initially wrote it, nobody knew what to call Pluto. Then they decided dwarf planet, so then I had to rewrite it. Finally, for liberal church settings, to give children a sense that everything they learn about the natural world at school, on television, or through their own love of learning is also part of their religious understanding. Everything is religio, linked. What they believe and feel is not divorced from what they know. It's all integrated. Their world is not fragmented, it is whole. And they themselves are an integral part of it, with a sense of heroic possibilities for their own participation in that story. The story goes on through them, from the ancestors, the evolutionary impulse, that creative action, that impulse to be, is in them right now. And then it passes on to the future generations. Death is an integral understanding from the very beginning. So we've gone through these four evolutionary parables. We are made of stardust, great story beats, my universe story. That's the full year curriculum. I'm going to close with this. We are all cousins. When I wrote it, starting about 6-7 years ago, I called it Ancestor's Tale. I then turned it to River of Life. Now it's called We Are All Cousins. It's based on a 2004 book by Richard Dawkins called The Ancestor's Tale. And in it, he got a whole bunch of graduate students to be able to collect the information I'd been longing for ever since I became a science writer specializing in evolutionary biology and evolutionary ecology. What he got his graduate students to do is to take a journey back through time from where we are now, walking back through our grandparents, our great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents. How far do we have to walk back before another species alive today shares the same great-great-grandparent? Well, about 6 million years. Maybe actually different now with new discoveries going on, but about 6 million years, two creatures come in, chimpanzees and bonobos. And then walking back from there, and when does the next group come in? The amazing thing is to get from today all the way back to about 3 billion years ago or so, to the bacteria. There are only 40 places where all the millions of species alive today come in. Only 40 times. And you can think of it this way. All the plants come in all at once, right? All the plants are more closely related to one another. They've all joined, moving back through time, you know, with the trees to the ferns and all that joining in, and all the plants come in at one point in time. So here are the 40 confluences. You can't really see them well here, but again, you can see this on the website, on the Great Story website. I'd just like to point out a couple things here. Along the right, you see in red songs. Very rarely do I have any curriculum I do for kids without a song in there. Now, I'm not a professional musician or singer, but I love songs. And there are scientists who think that humans were singing before we were speaking. We were certainly moving, and we were probably going, whoa, 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 before we actually had syllables mean anything. Songs are deep. Songs are emotional. I am an evolutionary humanist, but I need Silent Night every Christmas. I imprinted on that song. So anyway, these are the songs. The way I run the program, we have the first with chimpanzees and bonobos. We keep walking back to the second place where it comes together. It's gorillas. Orangutans are at 14 million years ago. Gibbons at 18 million. And then I have a song I sing here. You can, again, you can find this from the kids' curriculum page. You'll be able to click on the We Are All Cousins, and from there you can get to a YouTube clip where I have this. It's called Ancestor's Tale for Kids, part 1 of 2. I'll give you a hint. Okay, grown-ups and Wes not allowed to answer. Here's the hint. Wes gets the next chance, but because you all might not get it, here's the hint. Ready? It rhymes with the word ribbon.
Gibbon.
Yes. Look at that. Gibbon. Gibbon. Excellent. No, because apes.
It doesn't have a tail.
It doesn't have a tail, exactly.
It's an
Apes don't have tails anymore. Isn't that amazing? Okay, so we've just, anytime you see that we fill up a whole chart like this, means we've finished something, and so we have to celebrate it. So we've gone through 5 different confluences here. We've gone through all the apes, all the way back, or 4 to 18 million years ago, and it's time for a song. So I'm going to sing it. See the 4 here? Oops. Uh-oh. Very good. Very good. Okay. Okay, so the first one is chimpanzees and bonobos. The second one is African gorillas, and the third one is and the fourth one is Malaysia. This is part of Indonesia. Okay. So here's how the song goes. I'll sing it through once, and then you can join me, and then we're going to keep getting these verses all the time when we celebrate our ancestors. Chimpanzee, bonobo, African gorilla, Asian orangutan, gibbons of Malaysia. These are our tailless ape relatives. These are our tailless ape relatives. Join me. Chimpanzee, bonobo, African gorilla, Asian orangutan, gibbons of Malaysia. These are our tailless ape relatives. These are our tailless ape relatives. Very good. All right, we come to 5 million.
100.
How many million years ago?
25 million.
Did our great-grandparents have to live with any dinosaurs at that time? No, they were already extinct. How many species come in?
Like 100.